Nestled on Carolwood Drive in Los Angeles, the sprawling estate of Walt Disney has long been a place of fascination. It was here, among the luxurious rooms and personal railroad, that Disney dreamed up many of his creations. But over the years, whispers of unexplained occurrences have cast a shadow over this once joyful home. Visitors and caretakers have reported unsettling phenomena, particularly in Disney's private office. Though unoccupied, the room seems alive with an eerie energy. Late at night, the office light flickers on, casting an uninvited glow across the hallway. Despite repeated inspections, no faulty wiring has been found. The eeriest reports involve the sound of a pen scratching against paper. Staff have sworn they heard the rhythmic strokes of writing, as if Disney himself were sketching his visions from beyond. These sounds, faint but unmistakable, echo through the mansion's silence, often accompanied by soft, deliberate footsteps. One caretaker, hired to maintain the property in the 1990s, recounted an unforgettable experience. "I was locking up for the night," he said, "when I heard the office chair creak. I turned to look, and the light was on. I knew I had turned it off earlier. Then came the sound of pen scratching on paper. I was frozen in place. It stopped as abruptly as it started. But the feeling in the room was oppressive, like someone was watching me." A visitor to the estate on a private tour described similar sensations. "The office had this strange pull," she said. "I felt compelled to look inside. As I approached, I heard footsteps retreating, but no one was there. The air was thick, like the room was holding its breath. The current owners of the property have embraced its peculiar history but prefer to leave certain areas undisturbed. The office remains untouched, its door often closed, as if to contain whatever lingers there." What causes these occurrences? Some believe it's Disney's restless spirit, still driven by his passion for creation. Others think it's the energy of the dreams and ambitions that once filled the house. Whatever the explanation, the Carolwood Mansion stands as a reminder that some legacies refuse to fade, even in death. As the years passed, the mysterious occurrences at Walt Disney's Carolwood Mansion only seemed to intensify. Though the estate changed hands a few times, those who lived there or worked nearby would tell you that there was something unsettling about the place. One evening, a man who had recently moved into the house, hoping to enjoy its history and grandeur, decided to spend his first night alone in the mansion. He was aware of the rumors, of course, who wouldn't be, but he dismissed them as mere superstition, the kinds of stories that grow over time. That night, after a long day of settling in, he retreated to the office. He wanted to get a sense of the room which had always intrigued him. It was a space where so many of Disney's ideas had come to life, a part of history in itself. But as he stepped inside, a strange coldness gripped the air. He shrugged it off as a draft, but the chill didn't let go. He closed the door behind him, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. As he walked around the room, his eyes scanned the desk where Walt Disney had once worked tirelessly. The papers, still neatly arranged, looked untouched, and the lamp on the desk was dark, though there was a soft glow from the hallway outside. Then he heard it, the sound of a pen scratching against paper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the very desk he stood at. His heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the sound, but no one was there, just the empty desk, and the scratching, growing louder. Frozen in place, the man watched as the lamp flickered on, its light spilling across the papers. For a moment, he was sure he saw the faint outline of a figure, an outline so delicate, so translucent, that it could have been a trick of the mind. The figure was seated at the desk, its hands moving methodically across the paper, as though drawing invisible lines. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The man's breath caught in his throat as he turned, expecting someone to appear at the door. But no one came. The footsteps stopped just outside the office, and then there was silence. Trembling, the man approached the door and opened it cautiously. The hallway was empty, but the temperature in the house had dropped, the air heavy with an unseen presence. He stepped back into the office, his eyes scanning every corner. The lamp remained lit, but the figure was gone, leaving only the lingering sound of the pen. He made his way to the desk and reached out to touch the paper, his fingers brushing against the surface. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he quickly withdrew his hand. But then came something even stranger. The paper, which had been completely blank moments before, now had faint marks, lines, curves, symbols that seemed to form a drawing. A single, incomplete image, like a half-remembered vision on the edge of his mind. He stared at the marks for what felt like an eternity, as the footsteps resumed their slow, deliberate pacing outside the room. With each passing second, the house felt more alive with unseen eyes, as though Walt Disney himself was still present, in some form, guiding his hand and forcing his thoughts onto the paper. The man couldn't explain what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone in that house. And whatever lingered there, whether it was Walt Disney or something else, had no intention of letting him forget it. And so, the strange events continued, growing more frequent as the days went on. Staff began to notice the cold drafts, the light flickers, and the soft sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. One evening, a housekeeper found a note tucked under the door of the office, written in a hand that wasn't her own. It simply read, "I'm still here." The mansion, once a place of magic and creativity, had become a haunting reminder that some spirits refused to leave their creations behind, even in death. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still, the office would once again come alive with the soft scratching of a pen on paper, waiting for the next dream to be born. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As the days bled into weeks, the house on Carolwood Drive began to take on an unsettling character of its own. The staff had grown accustomed to the peculiarities: the lights that flickered at odd hours, the feeling of being watched in the otherwise empty hallways, but no one dared to venture into the office at night. It became known as a space best left undisturbed. But the rumors grew. Local residents spoke in hushed tones about the mansion, sharing stories of how they'd seen strange lights moving across the windows late at night, long after the house should have been dark. It was always the same. A soft glow from the office, steady, as if someone was at work inside. One night, a curious neighbor, who had lived next door for years, decided to take a walk after dinner. She'd always found the mansion fascinating, though she never got too close until the stories became too much to ignore. She noticed the familiar light glowing through the window, just like the others had said. Unable to resist, she walked up the stone path, the wind brushing through the trees as though urging her to stop. But her feet carried her forward. When she reached the front door, it stood ajar, the darkened hallway stretching ahead of her like an invitation. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but then stepped inside, thinking she might catch a glimpse of something or someone behind the curtains. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she froze. The office door, once closed and locked, now stood wide open. There was no one in the hallway, no sound except for the distant, rhythmic tapping of a pen. She stepped closer, feeling the temperature drop with each step. The air was thick with something she couldn't quite place: tension, maybe, or a sense of inevitability. The closer she got to the office, the more intense the sound became. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of a pen on paper, as though it had been waiting for her. She pushed the door open with a slow creak and found the room exactly as it always was, yet somehow different. The desk was empty, save for a single sheet of paper in the center. It was blank, yet she felt as though it were calling to her. Her eyes were drawn to it, and without fully understanding why, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the paper. The moment her skin touched the surface, the pen stopped. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of the suffocating silence around her. She could almost feel the weight of eyes on her, though she was alone in the room. But then the paper shifted almost imperceptibly. It was as if something unseen had nudged it, causing the slightest ripple in the fabric of the air. She gasped and stumbled back as the pen, which had previously lain untouched, lifted on its own. It hovered above the paper, then began to move slowly, at first drawing lines, then shapes. No one was holding it, yet it moved with a deliberate, purposeful grace. She watched in horror as the pen sketched a simple image of figure, half-formed, its outline still rough, as though it was just beginning to take shape. The lines grew bolder, more defined. It was a silhouette of a man, but not just any man. A man she recognized from the old photographs she had seen at the local library. Walt Disney. As the figure solidified on the paper, the air around her seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. The temperature dropped further, and the faint smell of ink filled the room, overpowering and sharp. Her mind raced. Was this a sign? Was this Walt Disney reaching out, or something far more sinister, using his image as a mask? Then, the pen stopped again, but the figure on the paper wasn't the only thing that had changed. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, like someone walking just a few inches from her. She turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued. Tap, tap, tap. Closer now. Her pulse raced as she backed away from the desk, but the feeling of being trapped, of being drawn into something, was overwhelming. She glanced at the paper once more. The figure was now fully formed, but its eyes were different, alive, watching her. It was as though the figure on the page had broken free from its confines, now aware of her presence. Terrified, the woman bolted from the room, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't stop running until she reached the front door, but when she looked back, she saw the light in the office flicker one last time. A shadow moved behind the window, and the pen began to move again. The woman never spoke of what she had seen that night. She couldn't. The experience had shaken her to her core, but it wasn't until months later that she realized just how deep the mansion's hold on its visitors ran. She didn't return to Carolwood Drive after that night. In fact, no one did, at least not in the same way. Those who lived in the area began to notice that the house remained strangely undisturbed, like a relic suspended in time. The rumors about the mansion's paranormal activity began to take on a new life, no longer just tales of flickering lights or disembodied footsteps, but something darker, something far more inexplicable. One evening, a group of curious thrill-seekers, fascinated by the mansion's history, decided to visit. They had heard the rumors of the haunted office, the unexplainable lights, the whispering pen. Armed with cameras and flashlights, they ventured through the darkened streets of Los Angeles, the Carolwood mansion looming ahead like a ghost from the past. They approached the gate cautiously, exchanging nervous glances, half expecting something strange to happen before they even set foot on the property. The gate creaked as they pushed it open, its sound carrying like a warning. The air around them felt dense, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere of the mansion was weighing down on their shoulders. The mansion stood silent, its windows dark, but they could feel its presence alive, watching, waiting. As they made their way toward the front door, one of the group noticed something odd. A figure standing motionless behind the window of the office. It was only for a split second, but it was enough. "Did you see that?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. The others nodded, though no one said anything further. They reached the door and found it unlocked, just as it had been for the woman months before. With the same sense of dread, they stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, but there was something else, a lingering chill that didn't quite belong. It was then that they heard it, a soft tapping. At first, they thought it was just the house settling, the familiar creaks and groans of an old building. But the sound grew more insistent, sharper, more deliberate. Tap, 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 like the scratching of a pen. It seemed to come from the direction of the office. Without a word, they moved toward the source of the sound, their flashlights flickering nervously. As they passed through the hallway, they saw it. The door to the office was slightly ajar, just as it had been the night the woman had fled. They hesitated, but curiosity pulled them forward. One of them pushed the door open, and the beam of light from their flashlight fell across the desk. There, on the paper, lay a new drawing, a stark, bold image, one none of them could have expected. It was an image of them, the group. They stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the paper, each figure drawn with uncanny precision, their features captured perfectly. But something was wrong. The figures were all staring at the viewer, their eyes wide and hollow, filled with an unnatural, unsettling depth. The group backed away in shock, but then something even stranger happened. The pen on the desk began to move on its own, as if it were being guided by an invisible hand. It dragged across the page, leaving new marks, new lines, as though it were adding to the drawing, filling it in. One of the group, desperate to understand what was happening, stepped forward. This is impossible," he muttered, reaching for the paper. But before he could touch it, the pen stopped, and a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind them. They turned, now trapped, the door refusing to budge. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the frigid air. The light from their flashlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then the footsteps came again, slow, measured, purposeful. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, the sound was no longer coming from the direction of the desk. It was coming from the hallway, from behind them. They turned slowly, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the hallway stretching out before them, the air thick with an undeniable presence. But as they stood frozen in place, one of them caught sight of something that made their blood run cold. A shadow standing at the far end of the hallway. The figure was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was still watching them. Its eyes, if they could be called that, seemed to gleam with an intensity that froze them to the spot. Suddenly, the sound of the pen returned. A quick, frantic scratching as the figure in the hallway took a step forward. The group turned, panicked, desperately trying to escape, but the room had changed. The door remained closed, unyielding, as if the house itself had sealed them in. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by low, almost inaudible whispers that filled the space, seeming to come from all directions. It was as though the house itself was speaking, its walls alive with the echoes of its former inhabitants, its creators. And in the darkness, the pen continued its work, drawing something that no one wanted to see, something that no one would ever forget. The group stood frozen, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, the space narrowing around them. Each breath felt harder to take, the air thick with the oppressive presence that surrounded them. The shadow in the hallway moved again, gliding forward as if it were drawn by some unseen force. The figures in the drawing on the desk seemed to change, their eyes now wide with terror, as though they were witnessing the same horror unfolding before them. One of the group, the bravest among them, stepped forward, his voice shaking as he spoke. "We have to leave. Now!" His words seemed to slice through the air, but they did nothing to break the hold the house had on them. They were trapped, prisoners in a space that no longer obeyed the laws of the physical world. Another step from the shadow, and then another. It was closer now, so close that they could see the faint outline of its form, the grotesque details of its face, too faint to fully make out, but unmistakably there. It wasn't human. It wasn't something they could understand. The whispers surged louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak directly into their minds. "You shouldn't have come here," they heard, though no one had spoken. "You're part of the story now. You're part of the creation." The footsteps behind them grew louder, but no one dared look back. The group's panic was palpable, each person now aware of the inescapable truth: the house was alive, and it wanted them there. They were no longer just visitors. They were part of the history, woven into the very fabric of the place, like all the others who had wandered too close to its grip. In a frantic panic, the group began to push toward the door, one person pulling at the handle, another banging against the walls in desperation. The whispers were deafening now, their words twisted and maddening, urging them to stay, to accept their fate. And then, in the chaotic rush, one of them glanced at the paper on the desk once more. The figure, the one they had seen earlier, the one that looked like Walt Disney, its eyes were now open. Fully open. The figure had changed again. It wasn't just a drawing anymore. It was alive, its gaze following them, its mouth curling into a smile that didn't belong on any human face. "Help us," the figure seemed to say, though no sound came from its mouth. And for a moment, the group could almost hear the desperate plea in their heads. The figure now fully realized was not a creator, but a prisoner of the house, bound to it in a way they couldn't comprehend. The pen, still moving across the paper, seemed to scratch out one last message, something unspoken but understood. We're all trapped here. All of us. With one final, gut-wrenching scream, the group managed to break through the door. They stumbled into the hallway, but the world around them had changed. The house was no longer the mansion they had entered, it was something darker, something older. The walls seemed to pulse with an unholy life, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move of their own accord. They reached the front door, but it, too, was locked tight. The world outside felt farther away than it ever had before. They were cut off from everything they had known, left to face the truth that the house had claimed them. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the house grew silent. The door creaked open just a crack. They were free. But when they stepped outside into the night air, they looked back, and for the briefest moment, they saw it. A flicker of light in the window, the unmistakable glow of a lamp in the office, the room where it all began. And the sound of the pen, scratching on paper, echoed across the distance. They never spoke of what happened that night, not to anyone. But they knew the truth deep in their bones. They had walked in the footsteps of ghosts, and the house had claimed them, just as it had claimed all those before them. Walt Disney's mansion on Carolwood Drive was not just a house. It was a place where history lived and where, sometimes, it refused to let go. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.